They called her just the janitor until the day she walked into the boardroom and fired the CEO. Not out of revenge, but because the company he destroyed was one she helped build. For 15 long years, nobody noticed Margaret Ellis. To the executives at Ridgewell Logistics, she was just Miss Maggie, the quiet cleaning lady with the worn sneakers and faded gray uniform. She arrived before dawn, pushing her squeaky cart past glass offices, erasing fingerprints and emptying trash cans like clockwork. People spoke over her around her, sometimes at her, but never to her. They didn't know that the woman mopping their floors once co-founded the very company they now ran with arrogance and waste. Decades ago, Margaret and her late husband, Leonard Ellis, poured their savings, time, and heart into starting Ridgewell. But after Leonard's sudden death, his business partner, Carl Manning, rewrote the rules and shoved Margaret out quietly. Rather than fight, Margaret chose patience over panic. She returned under the radar, disguised as a custodian, watching, listening, and taking notes. She kept every pay stub overheard, every cruel joke, and logged every unethical decision made under CEO Darren Clegg's leadership. The day finally came, when Darren humiliated her publicly, mocked her like she was nothing. That was the final spark. Margaret gathered every document, every receipt, and walked into the boardroom, not with a mop, but with majority ownership papers, legal counsel, and 15 years of silent truth. And then she did what no one ever saw coming. She fired the CEO and reclaimed her company. Margaret Ellis didn't rise up suddenly, she was always there. They just never looked closely enough. Margaret didn't seek revenge, she sought restoration. After reclaiming her rightful place as majority shareholder and removing Darren Clegg from the CEO position, the boardroom sat in stunned silence. Some members stared at her with awe, others with discomfort, unsure how to process the revelation that the quiet woman who had silently cleaned around them for years now wielded more power than all of them combined. But Margaret didn't gloat. Instead, she calmly looked around the room and said, "This company was built to serve, not exploit. And we've lost our way." The news of Darren's dismissal spread through Ridgewell Logistics like wildfire. By the next morning, the halls buzzed with shock and speculation. How could the janitor, Miss Maggie, actually be the owner? How long had she known? Why hadn't she said anything? But the gossip quickly turned into something else: respect. Employees who had once walked past her without a glance now looked at her with recognition, and for many a twinge of guilt. Margaret arrived at the office the next day in a navy blazer and low heels, no longer pushing a cart, but carrying a plan. She greeted the front desk staff by name, stopped to chat with the cafeteria workers, and took the elevator, not the stairs, to the executive floor for the first time in years. Her first action wasn't to reshuffle the top brass or demand a parade. Instead, she called an all-staff meeting, not for the suits, but for the people who kept the company running: drivers, warehouse workers, custodians, admin staff. Standing in front of them without a microphone, just her steady voice, Margaret said, "You never knew who I was. And that's okay, because it wasn't about who I was, it was about who you are, and what you deserved." The room was silent. "I've spent 15 years listening. Now I want to hear you out loud." Hands slowly began to rise. A warehouse driver asked if overtime pay would be reinstated. "Yes," Margaret replied. "And back pay is coming this Friday." A woman from HR timidly asked about health benefits. "Already under review," Margaret said. "And this time you get to weigh in." Someone in the back called out, "What about the people Darren let go for speaking up?" Margaret nodded solemnly. "We're reopening those cases. At the very least, you'll have your names cleared, and maybe your jobs back." There were no loud cheers, no fireworks, just stunned silence, then murmurs, and finally hope. For the first time in years, Ridgewell's employees believed that maybe, just maybe, the company could change. Margaret Ellis didn't just fire a CEO. She cracked open a window in a sealed, stale room. Fresh air was pouring in. But deep down, she knew the real work was just beginning. Just days after Margaret Ellis took her place at the helm of Ridgewell Logistics, the ripple effect of her actions began reaching far beyond the company walls. Word spread across the city, then the country, of the woman who had been overlooked for 15 years only to rise up and transform a toxic corporate empire. Margaret hadn't just disrupted a company. She had ignited a conversation about dignity, visibility, and power in silence. But Margaret didn't have time to bask in attention. She knew all too well that one clean sweep wasn't enough to undo years of rot. She created what she called the Voices First Initiativa program, where every department could submit anonymous suggestions, complaints, and even innovations. Every entry was reviewed personally by Margaret, and a small team she handpicked not from executive recruiters, but from the ranks of warehouse leads, dispatchers, and longtime admin staff. Then one morning her assistant knocked gently on the door. "Margaret, there's a call for you. Urgent, from DC." She raised an eyebrow. On the line was Deputy Secretary Helen Ashcroft from the Department of Labor. "Miss Ellis, we've been watching. What you've done at Ridgewell, it's resonating. We have a proposal." The government wanted her to join a national panel focused on reforming corporate labor standards, particularly those affecting hourly wage workers, custodial staff, and logistics professionals. They needed someone who had lived it, someone who understood the human cost behind profit margins. Margaret listened silent at first, as always. Then finally, she spoke. "If I do this, I won't be your token story. I speak plainly and I don't polish the truth to make it easier to swallow." "That's exactly why we want you," Helen replied. Within weeks, Margaret was flown to Washington, where she sat across from policymakers, CEOs, and senators, many of whom initially looked at her like she didn't belong. Until she opened her mouth. She shared the realities of ignored safety violations, whispered layoffs, and the silence that surrounded low-wage workers. Her voice, steady and sharp, sliced through the room. And just like that, the janitor-turned-chairwoman became a national force for reform. Back at Ridgewell, she hadn't lost touch. Weekly listening sessions continued. Old employees were reinstated. Wellness policies were revamped. And when Cynthia, the janitor whose son's accident had once been dismissed by HR, walked into Margaret's office with tears in her eyes and simply said, "Thank you," Margaret smiled softly. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank yourself. You stayed. You endured. You deserve this." Ridgewell had changed. But more importantly, Margaret had turned herself into a blueprint for companies' leaders and dreamers everywhere. Because the real revolution wasn't about who sat in the boardroom. It was about who had finally found the courage to knock on the door and say, "I belong here too." And when Margaret looked out at her team during a company-wide town hall a few days later, she said one thing that made the entire crowd fall silent. Power means nothing if it isn't used to lift someone else. And with that, Ridgewell didn't just become a company with a story. It became a company with a soul. Margaret Ellis didn't just stir the waters of Ridgewell Logistics. She cracked open the dam in the weeks following her national panel appearance in Washington. Something began happening that neither Ridgewell's board nor the government had anticipated. Other janitors, drivers, secretaries, and underpaid workers across the country began writing in. Hundreds of handwritten letters, emails, and voicemails poured into Ridgewell's HR office, all addressed to Miss Ellis. Some were simple, "Thank you for seeing us." Others detailed years of mistreatment and fear. But one in particular stood out. It was a letter from a woman named Carla Rivers, a night janitor at a large manufacturing plant in Michigan. She wrote of her 22 years in the same building, how she'd watched CEO after CEO step over her mop bucket without once acknowledging her. Carla ended her letter with, "They say we're invisible, Miss Ellis, but you showed me that even shadows can stand tall." That letter hit Margaret hard. She read it 3 times before setting it on her desk. That night, she walked through Ridgewell's warehouse just as she used to during her janitorial shifts. She greeted employees by name, paused to listen to their frustrations, and reminded them of something many had forgotten. Your value is not defined by what you wear, or where your desk is, it's in what you bring every day. But change doesn't come without pushback. A faction within Ridgewell's upper management, remnants of the old regime, began pushing back, quietly questioning Margaret's leadership style. They grumbled about disruptions and overcorrections. Some hinted that morale reforms were eating into profits. Margaret didn't flinch. At the next board meeting, she stood at the head of the table and laid out a simple chart. Employee retention had risen by 18%, productivity by 12%, and customer satisfaction had hit record highs. "You want to talk about profits?" she asked. "Respect is profitable. Humanity is sustainable. You just never tried it." The room went silent. To reinforce her vision, Margaret appointed a new chief people officer. Not an external hire, but a former warehouse shift supervisor named Malik Turner. She told him, "I need someone who's eaten lunch in the break room, not someone who's only read case studies about them." Malik's first move, a program called Ground Up, a mentorship and leadership pipeline for overlooked workers. Within months, janitors became team leads, and former interns were managing departments. Ridgewell became more than a company. It became a living case study of what happens when you trust the overlooked. Meanwhile, Carla Rivers, the janitor who'd written the letter, received a flight voucher and a personal invitation to visit Ridgewell's Birmingham headquarters. Margaret greeted her at the entrance not as a CEO, but as a sister in struggle. They walked the floors together, 2 women who had swept the same kinds of halls, and now stood in rooms once barred to them. And as Carla looked out the office window, she whispered, "I never thought I'd see the inside from this high up." Margaret smiled. "Then let's make sure no one else has to wait as long as we did." Because it wasn't just about one woman in a blazer with a mop in her past, it was about proving once and for all that respect doesn't trickle down. It rises when someone dares to stand. The headlines were still echoing. Janitor turned owner, reshapes, corporate America. But for Margaret Ellis, the real work was just beginning. After dismantling the toxic leadership at Ridgewell Logistics and establishing a new culture of inclusion, fairness, and accountability, she knew she couldn't do it alone. The question now wasn't whether change could happen, but how to make it last. Margaret's first step was structural. She implemented a profit-sharing program. Not just for the executives, but for every employee, from the warehouse crew and dispatchers to janitors and clerks. "If you help build it," she said, in a company-wide video address, "you should benefit from its success." That quarter, over 80% of the staff received their first ever performance bonuses. Some cried, some laughed, all remembered. Then she introduced a monthly open floor forum. It wasn't mandatory, and there were no PowerPoint slides, just a circle of chairs, and a promise: no titles, no filters. Margaret attended every session often, just to listen. One night during a forum in the Jacksonville branch, a forklift operator named Leo asked her directly, "What made you stay so long in silence?" She paused. "Because I wanted the truth to reveal itself, not just to me, but to them. If I'd stepped in too early, they'd call it bitterness, but 15 years of receipts. That's justice." The room fell quiet. Everyone knew she wasn't talking about just Crestwell or just Ridgewell. It was bigger than that. Her reforms didn't just stay internal. Margaret began partnering with community colleges and trade schools, funding scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing logistics operations and business degrees. The first full ride went to a young woman named Tanisha from Atlanta, whose mother had worked as a janitor for 2 decades. "I want to build a company that doesn't need a Margaret Ellis to clean up messes," she said at the scholarship launch. "One where no one is overlooked in the first place." But with progress came pressure. Former executives launched a smear campaign claiming she was too emotionally driven and inexperienced. A business blog accused her of weaponizing sympathy. Margaret didn't bother replying. Instead, she flew to a logistics expo in Chicago and delivered a keynote titled "The Cost of Disrespect." She stood on stage in a navy suit, no mop in sight, and spoke for 28 minutes about what happens when leadership loses touch with the floor, with the people with purpose. The applause lasted for nearly 5. Back at Ridgewell, culture continued to shift. Laughter returned to break rooms. People started making eye contact again. Office doors stayed open longer. Cynthia, the janitor, whose son had been denied a sick day, was now on the Safety and Wellness Committee. She proudly wore her badge every Monday like a trophy. As for Margaret, she never asked for a portrait in the hallway or her name etched in glass. She kept a framed note above her desk, instead the letter from Carla Rivers, the janitor in Michigan. Underlined in blue ink were the words, "Even shadows can stand tall." Because Margaret Ellis hadn't just fired a CEO. She'd rewritten what leadership looked like, and she'd done it not by stepping into power, but by quietly carrying it all along. With Ridgewell Logistics firmly on a new path, Margaret Ellis turned her attention beyond the company walls. What began as a personal reckoning had grown into a broader mission to lift the voices of the unseen, the unheard, the underestimated. She knew there were thousands of others just like her across America, pushing carts, cleaning floors, sorting packages in silence, overlooked but never without value, never. She launched the Unseen Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at empowering custodial and entry-level workers with leadership training, legal literacy, and pathways to ownership. The foundation's slogan was simple but powerful. "We build from the bottom." Within 6 months, over 2,000 applicants had signed up. Among them were janitors who had ideas for efficiency improvements, warehouse workers with years of undocumented innovations, and cafeteria staff who had kept entire operations running during crises without acknowledgement. Margaret personally hosted the first summit in Birmingham, Alabama, symbolically held in a community center across the street from Ridgewell's headquarters. Standing at the podium, looking out at rows of people in uniforms just like the one she once wore, she spoke without notes. "You've been told your worth is tied to a paycheck. That power belongs to corner offices. That being quiet means being small. But I'm here to tell you the truth. The foundation doesn't shake because of storms up top. It crumbles when it's cracked at the bottom. You're the foundation. You're the reason it stands." The room erupted. Some cried. Some stood in stunned silence. For once, they weren't being talked over, they were being spoken to. Back at Ridgewell, Margaret's reforms had inspired ripple effects in the industry. Competing firms began offering retention bonuses to warehouse staff and reassessing how they treated non-executive employees. Industry publications, once focused solely on market trends, started covering leadership ethics and employee well-being. One headline read, "The Janitor Who Changed the C-Suite." But with praise came resistance. A group of former shareholders filed a complaint, alleging Margaret had weaponized her status to push a personal agenda. The case didn't last a week. Every document, every transaction, every vote she had cast was fully legal. In fact, her transparency only made her position stronger. The attempt to undermine her became another example of why her work mattered. Then came a letter handwritten, no-return address. It was from a former Ridgewell executive. It simply read, "I never said thank you. I was one of the ones who laughed, one of the ones who looked through you. But I watched you rebuild what we ruined. I wish I'd seen you sooner. I hope you can forgive people like me." Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer next to the note from Carla Rivers and a photo of her late husband, Roland. She didn't need the apology, but she understood the weight behind it. Change wasn't about revenge. It was about remembrance and responsibility. And so as she walked the halls of Ridgewell each morning, not to clean but to connect, she carried with her a quiet certainty she wasn't just rewriting her story. She was giving everyone like her a chance to write their own. A year after firing Ridgewell's CEO and launching the Unseen Foundation, Margaret Ellis stood outside the very building she once cleaned, watching a new class of interns file through the front doors. They wore fresh suits and carried high hopes. A few paused to smile and greet her, not realizing she was the chairwoman of the company they were entering. She smiled back not out of pride, but because she knew the true power of being underestimated. Inside, the culture had changed. The break rooms no longer whispered with fear, and the janitorial staff had uniforms embroidered with their names, not as a symbol of rank, but of respect. There was now a Quiet Voices Council, an internal advisory board made up of warehouse workers, drivers, and maintenance staff who met monthly with executive leadership. Their insights had already improved efficiency and morale in ways expensive consultants never could. But one moment stood out above the rest. During an annual town hall, an older employee named Harold, who had worked in the mailroom for 27 years, was invited on stage. Margaret handed him a plaque recognizing his dedication, and the room erupted in applause. With tears in his eyes, he whispered to her, "For a long time, I thought no one even knew I was here." Margaret gripped his hand and replied, "They will now." She knew her fight hadn't been just about justice. It had been about dignity. For every overlooked janitor, every tired night shift worker, every soul told they were just support, she had carved a new path. Never confuse silence with insignificance. The people we overlook often carry the deepest wisdom, the strongest character, and the quiet power to change everything. Margaret Ellis wasn't a miracle. She was proof that patience, clarity, and integrity can move mountains when the time is right. So the next time you walk past someone in a uniform, ask their name. Say hello. Because someday that invisible person might be the one holding the keys to the whole building. Did this story move you? Leave a comment below, sharing your experience of being underestimated or recognizing someone's unseen strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that celebrate the power of resilience, courage, and everyday heroes. Because sometimes the janitor isn't just cleaning the floor, she's building the future.